Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor at Providence College. This is the first part of a two-part lecture on relativism. In this lecture, we will discuss specifically ethical subjectivism and contextualize that within the broader framework of relativism. Okay, to begin, generally when we speak about relativism, what we're talking about is that some x is relative to some y. In other words, that x is not a universal. So truth is relative to the individual would be epistemological relativism. Here we're talking about a relativism within the category of knowledge or epistemology, and truth would be one of those categories, and we're saying that it is relative to the individual. Some implied assumptions here is not only is x relative to y, but anyone who is not y cannot judge y as x. So if we believe that truth is relative to the individual, and I am not you, then I cannot judge your truth. So not only is x relative to y, but no one else can judge y. And typically when we talk about relativism, we like the idea that people can have their own beliefs and have some autonomy there, but then we get caught up in the fact that different people can have their different truths and claim that reality is not the way that it is. So if we're talking about epistemological relativism, we might be talking here about the anti-vaxxer movement, which makes different claims about vaccines than we would normally allow within traditional science. But let's move on to moral relativism. Here we're saying that moral rules are relative to some y. So the basic idea is that there are no universal moral principles, moral rules, virtues, etc. So again, it's the idea that some x, in this case moral rules, our moral virtues, our principles, is relative to some y. Now what would the y be? Well, there are three possibilities. The y could be society or culture, and so we would talk about cultural relativism, which is part 2 of this lecture series. Or we might talk about the individual, in which case we call it ethical subjectivism. Subjective there emphasizing the individual aspect, and that is the subject of this specific lecture. Or we might talk about a special brand of relativism called student relativism, which seems to affect many college students. And we're not going to address that in this lecture series, but I do recommend that you look up some articles on that if you are interested. So when we talk about moral relativism, and I said that we could speak either about ethical subjectivism or cultural relativism, let's just frame what the difference is between these two items. So ethical subjectivism is the idea that moral rules or principles or virtues are relative to the individual. So the individual designs or creates or makes up his or her own moral rules. In this case, no one can judge another person's moral principles. So if you believe that eating meat is morally right, and I believe that it's morally wrong, and we're ethical subjectivists, then we agree not to judge each other. A cultural relativism means that morality is relative to a particular culture. So here the culture determines what is morally right for the individual in the culture. And no one culture can judge another culture. So if you and I belong to the same culture, let's just pretend that we both belong to the American culture, and you believe that eating meat is morally wrong and I believe it's morally right, and the culture believes it's morally right, then I can judge you for being immoral by not eating meat. If, however, you belong to a different culture, let's say you belong to some other culture, the Zuzu culture, and they believe that eating meat is wrong, then I could not judge you according to cultural relativism. Now, another distinction we want to make about relativism is that between the descriptive and the normative kind. So if you've listened to my lecture on ethics, you know that the distinction between descriptive and normative is that a descriptive simply describes what the situation is, and the normative makes some judgments about it. So descriptive relativism would simply state that scientifically or culturally speaking, moral principles and values vary from culture to culture or person to person. As a descriptive statement, this says nothing about whether we are morally obligated to withhold judgment about moral principles in other cultures or other people. The normative claim, which will be the subject of our main lecture, is that morality should be determined by either the individual or the culture. Or, in other words, not only is it descriptively true that people differ in their morality, but a denial that a universal morality is even possible to exist. So, if we move on to ethical subjectivism insists that the individuals determine their own morality. So this is different from whatever a person believes is right for her is what that person believes is right for her. Obviously, we can all make that kind of claim without agreeing with that person's morality and making a judgment about him or her. It's also different from the idea that everyone has a right to determine what is the right thing for her to do. Within our tradition of liberalism and freedom, we believe that each person should make their own decisions about the right thing to do. Again, that's not the same thing as relativism. Rather, relativism is a denial that there is a universal morality. And so we might say that people have a right to determine what's right for them or him or her, but we still might believe in a universal morality. And in that case, we believe in the morality of freedom. Okay. So morality is not like measuring the size of a room. It's more about ideas that we come up with through reason to lead the best life that we can, or to make sure that, in simple words, to make sure that we're not jerks to other people. Now, ethical subjectivism seems to have a belief that whatever a person feels is right for that person. And no one person's view is better than anyone else's. So here there seems to be a relationship between the feelings a person has and what that person believes is right or wrong. This will be different from cultural relativism because cultural relativism will emphasize more than the feelings of a person. They will also talk about the sorts of reasons or the cultural tradition that we might think about. But ethical subjectivism doesn't have that possibility or foothold to stand on, and so it reduces morality in some sense to the person's feelings. Now, when we think about this, we might think about our good friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is a French Enlightenment thinker. One of his most famous books is Emile. And in Emile, he states that what I feel is right, what I feel is wrong is wrong. This is based on the idea popular among the Romantics, who are resisting the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, that in some sense society and reason disrupts our nature and makes us blind to what is really right. And so it's the idea that feelings are the best guide to the moral life. You might find this kind of idea also in the Star Wars genre. Luke is told to trust his feelings, and that seems to be an emphasis there as a sort of fictional account of what's going on. Uh, Rousseau was not alone in his thinking, however. A famous psychologist named Carl Rogers takes up Rousseau's point and basically makes this a mantra of modern and contemporary psychological therapy. So his idea is that when an action feels as though it is valuable or worth doing, it is worth doing. So what Rogers does in the tradition of the Romantics is emphasize feelings or emotions over the intellect. And so we should trust our feelings and be much more suspicious about where our mind leads us because it's more corruptible. A part of his goal, of course, is self-affirmation. And he sees self-affirmation as more important than self-evaluation. And this has a particular effect within contemporary psychology, where therapists are much more interested in affirming your position or affirming your experiences rather than helping you to evaluate those experiences. So that's one of the ways that philosophy has become practical in our everyday lives. But the question that we might ask is whether these feelings are reliable. Are they reliable guides for doing good things? And when we think about that, we might think about people like Albert Schweitzer or Martin Luther King Jr., or Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa is known for saying that she didn't really have any choice in going to Calcutta and serving the poor. And so we might think that maybe her feelings guided her to do this. And we might say the same thing about someone like Luke Skywalker, who eventually convinces his father to turn against the dark side and join him. On the other hand, we know other people who have been guided by their bad feelings. Primarily here, we might think of Adolf Hitler as a world historical figure, but we might also think about Craig Price. Now, Craig Price is a convicted serial killer, and his justification for his argument is that morality is a private choice. It was what he felt like he wanted to do. And so we might say in those cases, feelings are not a reliable guide, to put it shortly, to not be a jerk. They're not a reliable guide to help us to live in society or to be good people or to really be good for ourselves. If we were to embrace then either Jean-Jacques Rousseau's or Carl Rogers' ideas, we would have to say that Hitler and Price and Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, other serial killers, are the moral equivalents of Mother Teresa and Mahatma Gandhi. And that seems to be an absurd kind of proposition to hold. So we have at least some initial reasons to reject the idea that feelings are a reliable guide to our ethics. Right? But if feelings are not a reliable guide, then we also have to think about how feelings might ignore the feelings of others. So I don't have to tolerate others if I don't feel like it, or I don't have to respect others people's feelings if I don't feel like it. So again, another question coming up for whether feelings are a reliable guide for ethics. And we also might recognize that feelings are easily manipulated. We feel differently depending on the season and depending on the weather. We feel differently depending on what kind of food we ate. And certainly we know manipulative people who try to manipulate our feelings to make us feel one way or another. And so we want to be careful about saying that feelings are reliable guides when we know that they are so easily malleable and manipulable. So the idea here then is that feelings may not be reliable guides, but perhaps they can be educated. And this might be a way to use feelings to help provide motivations for us to do the right thing. And so we come out of this idea that feelings are reliable guides to the idea that maybe we can use them to help us find the right way if we can educate our feelings. And presumably that is part of the job of both the parent and the psychotherapist. This takes us back then to ethical subjectivism. If we believe in ethical subjectivism and that feelings are a reliable guide to what is right and wrong to do, then we have to take seriously the idea that we can hurt other people and exploit others without demanding any kind of justification just because we feel like it. Obviously, that doesn't seem like the best kind of life, even though we know many people, the Wolf of Wall Street, for instance, who build their careers on demanding from others things that they wouldn't normally want demanded from themselves, and who manipulate other people's feelings to benefit themselves. So if we accept ethical subjectivism, it seems to lead down this sort of dark path to kinds of ways of living that we wouldn't normally recognize as good. And of course, it can lead to other good ways of living, but we don't have a way within ethical subjectivism to distinguish our good feelings from our bad feelings. There's no way for us to make sure that we end up like Luke Skywalker rather than Darth Vader, to end up like Mother Teresa rather than Adolf Hitler. So what we need is a better guide. Right? We're all capable of a wide range of deeds, helping others, ignoring parents or our roommates, doing any kinds of sorts of things that we might be able to think of. But using our feelings to ignore the feelings of others seems to be problematic, and we need to have something else there to help us. So ethical subjectivism, as the first kind of relativism, seems to be a poor way for us to move forward. So in this first lecture on relativism, we've talked about relativism, the difference between normative and prescriptive. We've delved into ethical subjectivism and looked at Rousseau and Rogers and discussed some problems with using feelings as a moral guide. Thank you.